maybe a little bit more controversial. I think we, at this stage, 2014, now have to be open to a wider range of alternatives than I used to be willing to consider. Since the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s, the main focus has been on the so-called two-state solution, which, for the record, I still believe would have been the best outcome. Not a perfect result, but the best and certainly the most feasible. But it increasingly looks to me like two states for two peoples, to use President Obama's phrase, is not going to happen. And we therefore have to contemplate alternatives, even if those alternatives are not our first choice. The most likely alternative I see over the longer term is a de facto one-state, which is really what exists today, combined over time with a Palestinian campaign for equal rights within that larger state. There are lots of problems with this idea. I mean, it fits our notions of one person, one vote, but I think it would be unrealistic not to recognize that that route could be a very bumpy one. But if the two-state solution has been ruled out, right, if facts on the ground make it impossible, if the political circumstances there mean it won't work, then we have to start thinking about those alternatives. And remember, one person, one vote is pretty consistent with some things we believe in this country. And then my final lesson, final piece of advice, is to be optimistic. It often looks like the odds are against us. Groups like AIPAC and others will never be dislodged from their positions of influence. But I think history tells us that in situations like this, change can come with astonishing swiftness once a tipping point is reached. Look at the end of segregation in the United States. The widespread ban on public smoking, which you couldn't have imagined 30 or 40 years ago. 20 years ago, would anyone have predicted that gay marriage would be legal in 17 states in the United States? The lobby knows this, knows how rapidly things could shift, which again is why it is working overtime to keep critics from gaining any momentum at all. But I believe the ground is shifting, the ice is melting, and change, when it does come, will happen very quickly. So even if things look bleak in the short term, our long-term prospects are bright. And on that happy note, I will conclude. Look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
You can sit down if you want, take a load off. We're going to open discussion now, but one of our members of the Mass Peace Action Palestine-Israel Working Group, David Zackon, is going to lead the discussion. But I just want to emphasize our overriding theme that I think Professor Walt emphasized in his points 1 and 2, that the forces that are promoting the same policies in Washington now are not all powerful. One of the things that makes them appear invincible is the fact that there hasn't been and doesn't exist a coherent, effective, consistent opposition. And that's what we're about in Peace Action. We want to begin the conversation to how do we have an alternative that's effective, coherent, and forceful. And that's what I hope we'll focus on in this discussion that follows.
Phone calls. What's going to force my staff to spend the next 2 weeks dealing with this problem instead of whatever it is I would rather be doing? And that's a source of constituent power. That you don't have to represent some powerful and wealthy organization. If the phone calls keep coming in on a particular issue, a congressional office will notice that. They'll observe that. Now, that doesn't mean you'll necessarily sway them, but I do think that congressional offices are really quite sensitive to the pulse that they're getting from constituents. And on many of these issues, for many years, they've tended to hear from just one side and not from the other side. So I think that's an excellent plan, obviously. And I would, if I were talking to Ed Markey today, I would be reminding him of just how intransigent the Netanyahu government has been over the Democratic President Obama's efforts to achieve a peace settlement. I don't know how many times John Kerry has flown to the Middle East since becoming Secretary of State, but it's, a couple of dozen, I believe. And the number of hours he's already devoted to it when we have lots of other problems in the world, and he basically got stiffed, right? And this is a matter of public record. In fact, there was an article in an Israeli publication that came out a few days ago, a long interview conducted by an Israeli journalist with an unnamed American official or possibly set of officials, basically saying the reason this didn't work was that the Israelis were refusing to abandon the settlements. And I would be asking Ed Markey, how could he possibly sponsor this legislation for deepening the strategic partnership when we're not getting any cooperation from this particular ally? And ideally, you'd want to do that in public, so he has to try and defend it in public. Second, in terms of having some kind of email or Twitter or way of keeping people informed about these things, I also think that's a great idea because that allows you to respond quickly. My sense is that Americans for Peace Now does a very good job. The woman they have who does congressional things for them, I think her name is Laura Friedman, and she's terrific. And she really has her finger on the pulse of what's happening in different parts of Congress. And the good news there is it means that you don't have to spend, 30 hours a week trying to keep track of what might be emerging because she's doing it for you. And I would follow very closely what Americans for Peace Now puts out and then find a way to sort of broadcast that to your members. So that can be fairly efficient. And then third, the idea of a petition. I'm going to suggest something that will sound a little bit wacky, but you might want to consider it. What you really want is publicity for this. It's not just 10,000 names or 50,000 names or 100,000 names. What you want it is to be a news item. And one way to do that is imagine a petition that isn't just a stack of paper, but a petition that's something big, like a scroll that eventually is 500 feet long, a scroll that travels around the state on the back of a truck. You can maybe get an old truck from Scott Brown. That travel and goes to different places, goes to college campuses, right? And people can come hear a speaker and sign the petition if they want to. And then that becomes a news story. I was thinking of the AIDS quilt example as something that it was, the physical object was a remarkable thing in its own right, and it was a symbol of how much people cared about a particular issue. So it leverages what is ultimately just a list of names and turns it into a sort of a larger statement about a particular issue and then gets a news story. And then, of course, it creates controversy and people will try to ban you from a particular college campus, and that's good too, because that gets more publicity for the basic issue. So that's my again, off the top of my head. That last one I'm not sure is a good idea, but you might want to think about something along those lines.
Let me summarize. Yeah. I will try to repeat the question, but it was some useful observations that I can't do justice to. Basically, we're in a liberal state. We have liberal representatives. Why is it that when we do have access, and access has not been a particular problem, we get nowhere because they're preoccupied with showing either support for, loyalty, fealty, celebrating Israel? The visits that we pay to our liberal politicians don't result in any apparent change of heart, and that we're told things like, well, you should see, from Ed Markey, you should visit Ramallah because it's a 7% growth. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, the thrust of the question is basically correct, that this is a bipartisan problem. It's not that the Republicans have been terrible on this issue and the Democrats have been great for the last 30 years. Both parties have been equally bad. The Oslo Accords were signed when Clinton was president. He was a Democrat. He had the best chance, it seems to me, to produce a two-state solution of any American president, and he blew it. Right? He was succeeded by George W. Bush, who made it worse, and of President Obama, right, as progressive a president as we've had, allegedly, has failed as well. And the reason that these legislative acts, pass 380 to 11 or 85 to 2 in the Senate is because they're getting votes from Democrats and Republicans alike. So this is not a left-right issue, and it's not a Democrat-Republican issue. It is the fact that politicians in both parties have faced the same set of incentives, that if they were supporting Israel and occasionally doing so quite lavishly, as you say, sort of in ways that they would not talk about any other country or behave towards any other country, if they did that, they were guaranteed of no headaches on the issue. No one would sponsor a candidate against them. No one would attack them in their local newspaper. It would be easier to raise money in their next election. It would be harder for their opponents to raise money. No problems arise if they follow that line. If they step out of line, though, and start questioning it, give a speech saying that you think Operation Cast Lead was a bad thing, or that the Israeli war in Lebanon was foolish in 2006, which it was. If you say things like that, then suddenly you're in trouble. You have problems. You may be fine, you may win your next election, but who needs the headaches? Right? And that's true on both sides of the aisle, in the House and in the Senate, and until that changes, you're going to see the same sort of craven behavior. One more thing, there are going to be some members of Congress, for whatever set of reasons, who genuinely believe everything that they're saying to you. That's either because they've been fed a particular sort of one-sided view, or that's their own personal convictions, and it's a free country and they're entitled to that. But many of the people who say things like that, I believe, know that what they're saying is nonsense, but it's politically expedient, and so they're going to continue to say it, which is why that if the incentives ever change enough, things could change very quickly, because a fair number of politicians are saying things, I think, with their teeth gritted, and nobody really likes having to do that, having to say things they don't really mean because it's politically smart. I'm not saying that's true of Markey, or, I can't see what's really inside his head. But I think that is true for many American politicians, which is why you tend to get candid statements from them after they leave office, when they're no longer running for election, when they're doing their memoirs. Then you suddenly get them being somewhat more honest about what they really think.
So, of course, what you said and what Professor Walt said is true, but I think it's important to take note of something that may be changing. That is, this issue of overwhelming support for Israel is beginning to take on a partisan flavor, which, in fact, the Israel lobby is very nervous about. They have been at great pains to demonstrate that support is equal on behalf of both parties. It's the way they file legislation to always make sure the sponsorship is even, 50-50 Republicans, Democrats. But there has been a trend, especially at the base of the parties, whereby the Republicans are becoming more and more identified as the preferred, unyielding spokespeople for this present right-wing government, especially in Israel. And the Democrats, at least the base of the Democratic Party, is much less consistently pro-Israel than the base of the Republican Party. Opinion polls bear this out. The events at the last Democratic National Convention bear it out. This is an opportunity. When the base of the Democratic Party begins to become disaffected from the status quo, it gives us an opening to pressure these Democratic politicians. That is, their safety and security with their own base, which after all has to let them win primaries and then elections, becomes a little bit more questionable. And I think this is an area that we have to pursue. It's an opening, and what makes me think it's a good opening is because you can sense worry on behalf of the Israel lobby over this issue. So what you say is true, but also that we shouldn't forget there are some opportunities coming up.
Like we did for civil rights and for other people's rights.
Okay, let me put the question for the benefit of the videographer. As I understood it, and the speaker was a veteran for peace, how can we relate the struggle for civil rights in this country in the 1960s, where American Jews played an active role, to taking the lesson of the human element and applying it to relations in the Middle East?
Well, this is a sort of complicated issue, but there's two parts of it. One is that, and I alluded to this, if what's happening in Israel and Palestine now changes from being a sort of struggle over states and borders and turns into a discussion of civil and political rights for the Arab population of the area now controlled by Israel, then it becomes essentially a discussion of basic human rights, of the right to vote, the right to association, the right to free assembly, et cetera, to issues of equality very similar to the ones that were faced in South Africa, that were faced in this country for our first century, and then subsequently for our second century, sort of working out the aftermath of slavery. So all of those things begin to kick in, and I believe it creates a huge problem for the current government in Israel now, because in this moment in history, it is very difficult to sustain support. It's very difficult to defend any political system that systematically discriminates against a particular group of people. Right? So in that sense, all of the language of rights that we've wrestled with and had political struggles with over in this country, kick in a very big way there. Well, I think Congress, you have to have your head 3 feet under the ground to not have a more quote-unquote realistic sense of the peace process now. Anybody who still believes this is going anywhere is just not been paying attention for the last 20 years or so. And therefore, and it's not like people haven't genuinely tried. Their strategy has been, in my view, fundamentally flawed from the very beginning, right? And it has involved both recycling the same failed diplomats over and over again. We use the same people to do it, and they achieve the same result. And we follow essentially the same strategy.